Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for the warm greeting and for the opportunity to be together with you. Thank you for the work that you do all over the world. Work with compassion and wisdom and technical expertise. This is exactly what the world needs. And we can feel, Sonia and I were just saying, this wonderful atmosphere and the wonderful people here. We can feel the compassion and your dedication, and it's very moving and very inspiring to be together with you. This has been quite a week with the Tang Prize and visiting here and at Suzhou University and hearing all those nice things said about you. I just want the week to continue, if I might. But I want to thank you so warmly for such a gracious and wonderful week in Taiwan. There is no problem that we're facing that we cannot solve. In fact, it's rather absurd as well as tragic that we are still facing problems of extreme poverty in this world. As of today, the average income on the planet, averaged over the 8 billion inhabitants of the planet, is $13,000 per year. $13,000 is enough to live well, to not be in hunger, to have access to education and health care, water, safe water, sanitation, modern services, digital connectivity. In other words, the average income is enough to take care of everybody, and much more than enough to take care of everybody. The fact that we are in a world, however, in which billions of people are struggling, many are dying because of poverty, and we are fighting over resources is a matter of our mindset. It is not a matter of our physical or material reality or the lack of technological solutions. That's why it's so appropriate to be in a Buddhist setting, because all of the teaching of Buddhism is about mindset. It's the way we view the reality, not the reality itself, that leads to the suffering. The suffering can be escaped if we understand correctly our own attitudes and the nature of the world that we're in. So that is what I hope we can explore together this morning. How can we better use our knowledge, our technology, our vast wealth to end the suffering of material deprivation, of hunger, of lack of access to the most basic services, because this is absolutely feasible. The most important answer, of course, is that we redirect our attention, our activities, our resources to those needs. It would not require heroism to do it. It would require basic common sense. We are spending in the world today, by the most recent estimates, $2.2 trillion on military outlays alone. $2.2 trillion per year is more than enough to end all extreme poverty. My country, the United States, shockingly, is 40% of that military spending. $1 trillion per year. It's a deranged political system which happily votes for military outlays but refuses to vote for compassionate outlays. And this is deeply embedded in our political system today. And it's making the world so much more dangerous, so much more unequal, and so much more crisis-ridden than can be imagined. And by the way, it does nothing for the American people. This is not even a case of America exploiting the world. It's America endangering the world and ruining itself at the same time. Our life expectancy in the United States has declined now for the last 9 years. Our life expectancy now is 76 years, lower than in China, much lower than in Taiwan, 9 years behind Japan, and yet we are so rich that this is simply, again, a mindset crisis and translated into institutions that do not function. And in all of that, as our life expectancy has declined for the last 9 years, our Congress has done almost nothing except raise military spending. We call it military spending. I mean, we call it defense spending, but it's not defense at all. It's offensive spending. We heard The Economist magazine, I didn't know this quotation saying that Taiwan is the most dangerous place in the world. Beware of Anglo-Saxon publications, first of all. But let me say a word about danger and ways out of danger, if I may. The only place in Central America that is not in violent conflict is the country of Costa Rica. Costa Rica is extremely interesting because in 1948, Costa Rica unilaterally eliminated its military. It banished the army. It has no army. All the rest of Central America has an army. But Costa Rica is the only country to have avoided war. Having an army does not lead to peace. It does not lead to safety. Having an army leads to coups or provocation or perceived threats from outside or manipulation from outside, especially since the U.S. trains so many of the military. But it doesn't lead to safety. And my wife and I spent the past year while I was working at UNIDO in Vienna, living in a very interesting context. Austria was one of the countries occupied by the Soviet Union at the end of World War II. Almost all of the countries occupied by the Soviet Union at the end of World War II had the Soviet troops on their territory until 1989, typically in very repressive conditions. Austria was an exception. The Soviet troops went home voluntarily from Austria in 1955. It's a very interesting case to understand about war and peace. What happened that led the Soviet Union to voluntarily withdraw from Austria and then leave Austria alone for all of the period from 1955 until today? Was it that Austria is part of NATO? No. Austria, in fact, is the one country in the region not part of NATO. What happened in 1955 was that Austria clearly declared its neutrality, that it would never accept NATO or American troops or weaponry, that it would be a neutral country. And on that basis, the Soviet Union left, because Austria was not a threat. And so the troops went home. Austria became a vibrant democratic country, a really wonderful country, by the way, that has a tremendous quality of life and culture. And it was never once threatened by the Soviet Union or Russia since then, not in one single moment or one single episode, because it was not a threat to the Soviet Union or to Russia. It was a neutral country. It's a very instructive and almost completely forgotten episode in history. And it's an episode that deserves a tremendously deeper understanding, not only for Austria, but for what might have been in the world. Because one of the reasons that the Soviet Union made that step was that it wanted to set an example. The message in 1955 was, if a country becomes neutral, we leave. And the aim of the Soviet Union in 1955 was to try to convince the United States to have Germany be a neutral country. This is very interesting because, of course, Nazi Germany had caused more than 20 million deaths in the Soviet Union. And at the end of 1945, the Soviet Union, which had been more destroyed and had suffered more than any other country in the total deaths, demanded demilitarization of Germany. The United States said no. Starting in the late 1940s, the US started to arm Germany. And by 1951, the US zone of occupation, together with the British and French zone of occupation, had become the Federal Republic of Germany and had been incorporated into the new US military alliance, into NATO. And the Russians, the Soviets, were very concerned about this, because this was a remilitarization of a country that just a few years earlier had invaded and caused more than 20 million deaths. And the Soviet Union was saying to the United States, we need a peace treaty. We need an agreement. We need to stop the remilitarization of Germany. And the US was saying, no, we are NATO. We're against you. We will defend against you. And after Stalin's death and Khrushchev coming to power in 1955, the Soviet Union tried again. And the Austrian state declared its neutrality, and the Soviet army went home. And the message was, neutralize Germany and we can end the threat to us and we can find a new peace arrangement in Europe. The United States completely rejected the idea, said we will not have a neutral Germany, we'll have a militarized Germany. Our leading diplomat and historian in 1955, our greatest Russia expert, George Kennan, argued vigorously, let us have a neutral Germany. This way we'll have peace. This way we can end the confrontation with the Soviet Union. He was the author, no less, of the containment policy. But he said, I don't mean containment to be a new Cold War or hot war. I mean it to be a prudent policy. We should neutralize Germany. And in 1957, he gave the BBC Reith lectures calling for this, but he wasn't listened to. So we had a Cold War and an arms race and no peace, and nearly blew up the world in 1962, 61 years ago, because of a nuclear confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the roots of that, if you look deeply, actually involve Berlin and Germany. If you look deeply at the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was about the same issue. This is almost completely not understood, except by our finest historians. But it's not the way we tell the story at all. So the US gave up the chance for peace. Miraculously, the world survived. Then arose a very wise and peaceful and peace-seeking leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was truly a great man, an incredibly decent person. I had the privilege to be on his economic advisory team for 1 year, trying to help mobilize Western support for a collapsing Soviet economy. I failed completely in that because the US, again, was uninterested in doing anything, even to help a peace-seeking leader of the Soviet Union. And as you know, Mr. Gorbachev, President Gorbachev, unilaterally disbanded the Warsaw Pact military alliance in 1990. And at that moment, the leaders of the United States and Germany promised Gorbachev, we will not take advantage of that by expanding NATO even 1 inch eastward in response to your action. Of course, Gorbachev fell the next year, in part because of the financial crisis that the Soviet Union was facing, that the United States refused to help. And as soon as the Soviet Union ended, the strategists in the Pentagon and the White House and the CIA immediately began to plan the expansion of NATO. And so again, the US turned down peace. It could not take yes for an answer. I happened to be rather deeply inside the process in the Soviet, then Russian side, because after Mr. Gorbachev fell from power, President Yeltsin asked me to help advise Russia. I said, surely, Mr. President, the United States will understand now to give financial help. Maybe it could not understand with the Soviet Union, but surely with an independent Russia now. And again, the United States absolutely said we're not helping at all. And so just as these two leaders were saying, we want peace, we want normalcy, we want the end of conflict, the United States began planning the unipolar world. quite literally planning step by step. Even leaders in the Pentagon told one of the generals that I know rather well, Wesley Clark, that now the United States will launch several wars to overthrow Russian allied governments because we now know that Russia can do nothing in response. This is what Clark was told in the early 1990s. And the list included Iraq with Saddam Hussein, Syria with Assad, Libya with Muammar Gaddafi. And those are the wars that came. Those were planned wars. And the NATO enlargement was planned starting in 1992, but really planned in detail by 1997. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, the strategist and advisor to President Carter, wrote an article in 1997 explaining the timeline of NATO enlargement to Ukraine to be between 2005 and 2010. Of course, the Russian leadership said, no, don't do that. That's our red line. Don't cross it. The United States said, we don't hear you. You don't have any say in this. It's literally NATO doctrine, literally. It's enshrined in NATO doctrine that no country outside of NATO has any say in where NATO will enlarge, even if NATO is enlarging to a 2,000-kilometer border of the country. So the United States said, we will enlarge to Ukraine, and Russia, you have no say in it whatsoever. In 2007, President Putin said, don't do this. Do not do this. We're very concerned. We do not want you on our border. The United States. The United States ignored that, and in 2008 committed to NATO enlargement. This is why we have the war in Ukraine. The unrelenting pursuit of power and not listening to anybody else, to any prudent warnings at all. Interestingly, in 2008, the U.S. ambassador to Russia wrote a secret cable back to Washington. That ambassador was William Burns. He's now the CIA director. His secret memo got leaked by WikiLeaks, so we got to read it. Because other than leaks, we don't read anything of what the U.S. government really thinks. Everything is secret. And the media are not Storm media. They are USG media. So we read literally nothing but what the U.S. government wants us to read. But this memo was made public by Assange. And the title of the memo is Niet means Niet. And the content of the memo was, it is not just a matter of President Putin, it is every member of the leadership of Russia that opposes NATO enlargement. Pro-Putin, anti-Putin, doesn't matter. All Russian political class does not want NATO on Russia's border. And by the way, I don't blame them for one moment. Who would want NATO on your border? Not I. But it was ignored again. Kennan was ignored, Burns was ignored, Jack Matlock, our U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, was ignored. William Perry, our Secretary of Defense, was ignored. The ones that were listened to were Raytheon. They have military establishments in every congressional district. It's jobs, it's money. They pay for all the think tanks on the East Coast. It's big business. Biden has been part of that for more than 30 years. But basically every president is by the time they get there. And so the U.S. could not listen to a red line. And then I won't go through all of the rest of the history because this is not our main topic, but it really is our main topic. In 2014, the U.S. helped to overthrow the last Ukrainian government that just wanted calm, because President Viktor Yanukovych wanted neutrality. He's being pulled by the U.S. on one side. He's being pulled by Russia on the other side. He's trying to keep calm. So he gets the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, to vote for neutrality. Smart man. Then Europe is saying, you must sign our agreement with us now, now, now. And President Putin's saying, no, don't sign. You will divert trade. We are your major trading partner. We have to be part of this trade agreement. And Europe is saying, Russia, you have nothing to do with this. And Russia's saying, yes, but you are making a trade agreement. We already have a trade agreement with Ukraine. We're party to this. No, no, you have nothing to do with this. Because this is a game. This is not honesty. This is not grown-up behavior. And so a protest started when Yanukovych delayed signing the agreement with the European Union, and the U.S. stoked the protest behind the scenes, pouring huge amounts of money into the protest, funding it. I know it. I saw it with my own eyes, by the way. Leading American NGOs working side by side with the government, pouring in vast money for that protest. Not saying we don't want to interfere, directly leading the protest. And then a violent overthrow of the government, and the new government came in and said, we want NATO. And then the United States said, we'll make you safe. We'll give you lots of armaments. You'll be perfectly safe. And so the U.S. started a mass sale of arms to Ukraine, guaranteed to destroy the country. Absolutely. Clear as could be. They did it. They absolutely destroyed the country. Because at the end of 2021, President Putin made one last try, stop NATO enlargement. And on December 17th, 2021, he put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement. And he had some very important correct points. And I'm not a Putin apologist. I am an objective observer over the last 30 years. President Putin observed the following. First, stop NATO enlargement to our border. Second, the U.S. had walked away from the anti-ballistic missile treaty unilaterally in 2002, and it had basically ended, it started to place Aegis missiles in Poland and Romania. And Putin said, we don't even know what is in those silos, but it's a few minutes from Moscow. This is intolerable. You unilaterally left a treaty Now we are vulnerable. The United States said, we don't negotiate with you. And in January 2022, the U.S. gave a formal reply to Putin. And the formal reply is, NATO enlargement is none of your business. Literally, that is U.S. policy. It's none of your business. Not that we will sit down and discuss, negotiate, try to understand your security concerns. It's none of your business. I actually called the White House on December 30th, 2021, and spoke to one of the top officials, not to the president, and begged them, negotiate, avoid a war. No, no, Jeffrey, we don't have to negotiate. It's not really about NATO, I was told. I said, if it's not about NATO, say that NATO won't enlarge. No, no, we can't do that. And on February 21st, 2022, Russia Security Council met. President Putin asked Foreign Minister Lavrov, give a report of the status of your discussions with the Americans. Lavrov responded that we have received a firm reply of no negotiation over NATO. We have tried, Mr. President, but we did not succeed. The U.S. will not engage in negotiations. And 3 days later, the special military operation took place. Since then, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are killed. 10 million have fled the country. The economic collapse is probably more than 50%. Ukraine is losing around 1,000 soldiers every day, killed or seriously wounded right now. This so-called offensive or counteroffensive is a death trap. And the U.S. knows it, but we have a presidential election coming up, so we can't quite say it, because that might be embarrassing for the president. And so Ukraine is told, keep throwing your soldiers 1,000 a day to their death or to their permanent disability. And they keep doing it. That's why we don't have sustainable development. Because we're not even trying. How many times has President Biden said sustainable development goals? I literally do not know one occasion where he has used the phrase. Can you imagine? I don't know of one occasion. One of my closest associates over the last 40 years, who was a senior U.S. official for a while, told me that it is U.S. Treasury policy not to use the phrase sustainable development goals, because they're afraid that some Republicans in Congress will object, that it's going to put America on the hook with all those poor people. And America doesn't want to hear that. And to give you a real status of the world right now, every country is supposed to have a sustainable development goal plan. And they're supposed to present it to their peers at the UN high-level political forum. And each year, 30 to 40 countries present their plans to the delegates. There are 193 UN member states, and 188 of them have made their plans known to the others. These are called voluntary national reviews, VNRs. 5 countries, only 5, in the whole UN have not made sustainable development goal plans. They are South Sudan, which has been in nonstop war, Haiti, which is in complete disaster, Yemen, which has been in nonstop war, Myanmar, which has been in nonstop conflict, and one more, the United States of America. Those are the 5. This is why we don't have sustainable development. As an economist, I've taken a particular view of this issue over the last 30 years as I came to understand it, starting in the early 1990s. And that is that for some of the things that poor people need, their governments simply cannot afford to provide them out of their own resources. So we need a world that has compassion, that provides some of the things that the poorest of the poor cannot provide on their own. And so starting around 30 years ago, I have been advocating basically nonstop that there should be more financial flows from the rich to the poor so that children in poor countries can go to school, so that they can be immunized, so that they can have a dose of anti-malarial medicine if they have a bout of malaria, and so on. And a lot of what I've done for 30 years is basic arithmetic. Thank goodness for Excel spreadsheets. I have multiplied the number of poor people by the cost of interventions, and I have shown that that amount is very small, but it's larger than the budget of the government of the impoverished country. So I have said, here is a gap, and we should fill the gap. It's not ingenious work. It's so simple that it should be absolutely the most basic exercise that any institution involved in sustainable development makes. Now, I want to explain 2 interesting facts about these calculations, beyond the fact that they show that a country like Niger, which just had a coup a couple of days ago, could never afford to have all its kids in school, given the impoverishment that it finds itself in right now. Maybe in 30 years it could, but right now it needs help. But here are 2 interesting facts. One is the IMF never uses such a calculation to decide how to address Niger or another low-income country in its actual budget programming. In other words, when the finance minister of Niger comes and the income in that country is a few $100s per person per year, and half the kids are not in school, and only 10% of the population has access to electricity, and so on, the finance minister comes to the IMF, and the IMF says, well, you have this much money, so learn to live with it, or die with it. Oh, you would like to have electricity? That's a privilege. Don't expect it. And that's literally, well, they don't say it that way. They just say, be careful, be prudent, don't spend more than you have. Not, we will help you to find the financing. So that's one part of the story. The other part of the story is interesting. For right now, in the last 2 years, I've been advising the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and the Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed of the United Nations, on what is the size of this financing gap and how could it be mobilized. And one basic part of the answer is the official banks that we established decades ago, like the African Development Bank, or the Inter-American Development Bank, or the Asian Development Bank, need to be operating at a much larger scale, because you have the needs and you have the current scale of operation, so the scale should be increased. And on that basis, Secretary General Guterres called for what we called an SDG stimulus, a financial stimulus to help close the gap of what is needed to be spent versus what is available for spending. Very straightforward. And it would involve the rich countries as a group putting in something like $100 billion a year. For the United States, $20 billion a year, for example. Now, we're a $25 trillion economy. So $20 billion is rounding error. It's not even noticeable. $250 billion is 1% of GDP. $25 billion is 0.1 of 1% of GDP. So this is 0.08 of 1% of GDP. You know what the United States just said last week? It said, we don't think it's timely to increase the capital of the multilateral development banks. Translation. The President of the United States does not want to say a word about this because maybe Congress would object and say you're wasting U.S. taxpayer money on poor people. Maybe the rich would have to pay a little bit more in tax, but that's impossible because the rich finance the whole political system. And so the U.S. says it's not timely. For who? For the people who don't have enough to eat today? For the child who's not in school today? Who's it not timely for? It's not timely for the American plutocracy. That's all. So I don't really know whether economics is needed in any of this anymore. We need Buddhism. We need compassion. We need Ren. We need benevolence. I've come to believe that the Sustainable Development Goals are as simple as the ABCs: Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius. Aristotle, by the way, who's my favorite philosopher because I know him well, he is at the core of the glorious side of the Western philosophical tradition, had the basic idea of human beings, that human beings are a mix of animal instincts and higher rationality. And it is our purpose, our end, to think and to behave properly as rational human beings, including decently in our social order, in our political order. The Buddha, of course, and I'm here to learn from you, taught compassion as the basis of escaping the cycle of suffering. And Confucius taught virtue and cultivating virtue. And he taught that all people are brothers within the four C's, that this is one humanity and one world. If we abide by the ABCs, we will achieve sustainable development. Thank you very much.